Welcome to the Thriving Ministry with Young Adults, Holy Yearnings, Holy Listening, Holy Partnerships webinar series. Today is the third webinar, and we are talking about the alienated and the ambivalent. I'm Martha Rudy, and I serve as the Connectional Learning Coordinator here at Garrett-Evangelical. I will be the moderator for this webinar series, and I'm the voice you hear off screen. During this webinar, you will be in view and listen mode. If you experience technical difficulties or if you have questions for our presenters, please type them into the Q&A feature found at the bottom of your screen. You can send your questions at any time during the presentation, and I will ask them during the Q&A portion toward the end of the webinar. If we are unable to answer all questions during the webinar, we will ensure the presenter receives the unanswered questions, and we will provide her responses to all participants via email. This webinar is being recorded. The list of participants is private, and when I ask your questions aloud, I will not identify you by name. I will send you an email with a link to view this webinar within 72 hours. So without further ado, I would like to present Dr. Karen Mosby.
Greetings and welcome to our webinar series. Let me begin by sharing with you a little about who I am, what I do, and why this work with young adults is so important to me. Currently, I serve as the chaplain for Garrett-Evangelical Theological Seminary. This position gives me the opportunity to walk alongside our students, many of whom are young adults, entering Garrett directly out of college or in their late 20s. They allow me to hold space with them, to listen to them, and journey with them as they are growing into their ministerial identities. I'm also a fourth-year PhD student at Garrett in the Christian Education and Congregational Studies track. My primary research interest is located at the intersection of faith formation, Black millennials, and popular culture. This interest, or my interest in this area, really began during my research for my Doctor of Ministry degree, wherein I worked in a local congregation where I served, and I worked specifically with a small group of millennials, and they became a sermon preparation group for me as we studied text together, and their understanding and their biblical hermeneutics informed my preparation for preaching. Finally, for the last 3 years, I've been able to participate in Garrett's Young Adult Initiative as a predoctoral research fellow. I am also the mother of millennial fraternal twins, so I guess you could say that my life is framed by young adulthood. While reading the book, Joy Unspeakable, Contemplative Practices of the Black Church, written by Dr. Barbara Holmes, I encountered the following quotes in one of the closing chapters of the book. Dr. Holmes stated, "The ancestors must be laughing. How could we have forgotten so easily that prophets arise in every generation?" When I read that quote, it resonated within me at my core. It reawakened me to the truth that God indeed moves within every generation to provide wisdom, vision, and provision for the work that must be done. I believe that each generational cohort of youth and young adult offers us a prophetic witness because of the particular lenses through which they view the world. We may miss their wisdom, though, because it comes packaged and presented in the unfamiliar voices and sometimes radical voices of young people whose methods often generate turbulence and discomfort. However, the biblical witness testifies that this is the nature of prophets. God's prophets arise among us. Their messages are generally not what we want to hear, but they are what we need to hear. Dr. Holmes's words have become words that ground and guide my work, and I present them here as an overarching theme for this webinar. The series titled Thriving Ministry with Young Adults is both descriptive and aspirational. It is one way of framing the work we are doing with our Lilly-funded Innovation Hub. It has been our belief from the beginning of this initiative about 3 years ago that there are young adults within faith communities and within proximity to faith communities who could tell us what thriving looked like for them. We believed that if we created opportunities to acknowledge and listen to their yearnings and opportunities to partner with them where they are, we could learn from them. We knew that young adults are speaking, maybe even screaming, in order to tell us something. They are living into the promise of Joel chapter 2, verses 28 and 29, and Acts 2, that read, your daughters and your sons will prophesy. As people of faith, we feel strongly that we are called to a critical hope that on the one hand faces the reality of this present moment. In other words, the reality that increasing numbers of young adults are disengaging from mainline denominational churches. And on the other hand, as people of faith, we hold on to the vision that there are different and innovative ways of being church that will allow for re-engagement with our emerging generations. And when I say emerging generations, I am referring to coming generations of youth and young adults. We remain hopeful that each new generation of young adults will survive and thrive in partnerships with reimagined congregations of God's faithful people. We have never seen a large, diverse, technologically savvy, educated, entrepreneurial generational cohort of young adults like millennials before. They have foreshadowed for us what lies ahead. In other words, future generations of youth and young adults, for example, Generation Z, who are changing the religious landscape. Even though millennials have been new to us, standing at the crossroads is not new for the people of God. We have been here before. Our biblical ancestors stood at the Red Sea and they had to choose between going back to a place where they would remain in bondage, stand still, which would mean certain death, or proceed forward into a future that they could not see. Likewise, the community of faith who witnessed Jesus' death and burial had to decide whether to remain fearful, isolated, and paralyzed, or believe the reports of the women about Jesus' resurrection. We have history as a people of God with what seems impossible, with what has never been done before, and with worsening situations. God has been our companion in these spaces in the past, and God has always sent us witnesses to call us forth. Our current generation of young adults, we are asserting, are God's witnesses for us. They are doing more than critiquing the church. They are pointing out possibilities for our future together. Let those who have ears hear what the Spirit is saying. Today's webinar, entitled Alienated and Ambivalent, highlights two themes from the Young Adult Initiative research that relate to painful past experiences of church and their ambivalence toward the Christian label. Admittedly, millennials are not the first generation of young adults to have negative encounters with the church or with Christian congregations, or have tentative feelings about what it means to be called Christian. However, because of their current position as the largest young adult generational cohort, with their escalating departure and turning away from traditional mainline denominational churches, it heightens their impact on the religious landscape in the United States. Their experiences and their responses, as I suggested earlier, represent trends in the relationship between youth and young adults and Christian congregations that will not change by itself, will not change without intentional intervention. This webinar will situate young adult research, young adult initiative research within the broader context of young adult experience in the United States. It will examine two major findings from our young adult initiative research, suggest two key biblical and theological implications of our findings, and offer some activities or exercises throughout this webinar for naming, reflecting, and acting. We hope you'll have some paper and a pencil or a writing instrument available to participate in these exercises throughout the webinar. What do you see? When you look at the slides on the screen, I wonder, what do you see? How would you describe these photos? I posed these questions to a generationally diverse group of 41 first-year master's students recently in a classroom at Garrett. I received responses like, well, I see people at a concert. I see someone with a microphone about to sing or speak. I see a large group of people gathered somewhere outside. Well, it wasn't long before one of the millennials in the classroom responded, "These are photos of Kanye West at his Sunday service in Chicago." And he was correct. The photos are of the native Chicago rapper Kanye West performing at a pop-up event that he calls Sunday Service that was recently held in Chicago. He began holding these Sunday services sometime in 2018 as invitation-only gatherings on property that he owns. He later started holding these services around the country as free, impromptu, or pop-up events. Most of them people didn't get but a day's notice before the event. These services are known for featuring very high quality gospel music and for attracting thousands of people, including large constituencies of young people who are energetic, enthusiastic, and engaged. On the weekend the Sunday service came to Chicago, the free passes were completely distributed within 2 hours of the announcement of their availability on the Saturday before the event. The news reported that people began standing in line as early as midnight to enter the event, which was scheduled to begin at 9 a.m. While certainly some people show up at these services because of the entertainment and celebrity factor, many young people are reporting that these gatherings for them are spiritual, inspirational, worshipful, strengthening, transformative. They report that this is a space where they find belonging, freedom, relevance, welcome, and are uplifted. The services are church-ish in the sense that the music is all gospel, but there are no formal sermons, official or traditional liturgy. There's no collecting of money, no church announcements, etc. After Kanye West performed in Chicago, signs of an ancient generational divide began to surface on social media platforms like Facebook. There were both lay and clergy Christians who on Facebook began to critique the crowds that showed up for the events, saying that they would show up for a concert on Sunday morning, but they wouldn't show up for Sunday services at a church. They disagreed with the event being held on Sunday morning at the same time most Christian congregations worship. Some determined that this so-called Sunday service was solely entertainment and that Kanye West is not an authorized or legitimate religious leader. He was more like a false prophet, they said, who was misleading people into something that was more cultish than anything else. As you might imagine, the responses from youth and young adults, both Christian and non-Christian, were overwhelmingly more favorable. One millennial responded to the negative critiques via Facebook by posting the following: "To the church folk that's so tight about Kanye's service, you should have been there to pray with the folks and build connection with the unchurched, asking them if they have a relationship with God, not a church, but God, and pray the prayer of salvation. That would have been ministry. Y'all worried about the wrong thing. Who cares if they are at your church? Are they saved? Are they living a purposeful life? Are they seeking justice for the unjust? Are they giving to the poor? Are they being like Christ? I'm done." This young adult's comments could be heard as what some young folk call a clapback or a strong rebuke of those who judged Kanye's Sunday service as inappropriate or problematic. The comments of this young adult could also be heard as a call to return to the heart of Jesus's ministry as outlined in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 4, verses 16 through 21. Research within the broader context of young adults in the United States has found that young adults yearn for spaces where they belong, spaces where they are free to ask what Sharon Parks calls the big questions, express doubt, make meaning, and dream aloud without judgment, ridicule, and not being taken seriously. Many young adults are disengaging from expressions of faithfulness that are found in our mainline denominational churches. However, this does not mean that these young adults or all of these young adults are disengaging from God. Young adults yearn for authenticity, consistency, and transparency. They do not want the church to be created in their image. They want the church to reflect God's image and be committed to partnership with God in the world. Young adults are actively creating and identifying alternative spaces where they can express their Christian faith and or their spirituality. Let's take a few minutes to pause here. I invite you to do some seeing and naming by jotting down your responses to the following prompts. 1, Name 5 adults, young adults rather, name 5 young adults who participate in your congregation's governing boards or the primary decision-making bodies in your church. Can you name 5? 2, name 5 young adults who are not your family or not your close family, who are your who are your conversational partners. In other words, they are a part of the group of people you talk with and or spend time with on a regular basis. Name 5 young adults who you pray for and or with regularly. I'll give you just a few seconds to respond to these prompts. You may not necessarily be able to finish them all, but begin making your list. I invite you, as you are thinking up names, or even as you might struggle with coming up with names, to hold this exercise and continue to work on it perhaps throughout this webinar or after the webinar. We hope that the names you have already written down or the challenge you've had in identifying names to write down will generate further thought, conversation, and even action. For instance, if you were not able to write down names, perhaps that suggests questions that you and your congregation would want to consider. A significant number of the young adults who were interviewed for the Young Adult Initiative shared that they had experienced or witnessed situations, directly or indirectly, that left them hurt, disillusioned, and or no longer trustful of the church. One quick response to their concerns is that these were probably isolated incidents, or that all churches are not the same. And I would say both responses are probably true. But I invite us to suspend judgment momentarily. Imagine that these and other young adults, as Dr. Holmes alluded to in that quote I shared earlier, imagine that they are prophets speaking on God's behalf to the church as it is. Consider that these personal experiences might be directing us to larger or more foundational concerns that merit our attention. Think of the comments as presenting issues or those symptoms we describe to the doctor, and the doctor then has some initial information that helps them to identify what might be the root causes of our dis-ease or our dysfunction. In other words, what might God be trying to say to us through these young adults who are expressing past pain or church hurt, as some people have called it? Here are 3 comments that we heard during our interviews. 1, Christians are so devoted about going to church, but they would just do so many hateful things to my mother and myself. And I never understood how you could be so devoted to going to church and spew hate. A second comment, something that created distance between me and God was seeing a lot of hypocrisy in people who call themselves Christians, but will go drop bombs or are misogynist or racist. I'm pausing so you can kind of sit with of these words coming from our young adults. And thirdly, the church has been deadly in its impact on LGBTQ people, and the church needs to own that and do better. What did you hear in those comments? I heard experiences of brokenness caused by harmful behavior and or harmful speech from a member or members, maybe leaders of a Christian faith community. I heard perceived hypocrisy in terms of what Christians claim and what they do, particularly in terms of marginalized and minoritized groups. I think their comments might be pointing us to how positions taken by churches have resulted in individuals being excluded and alienated. The comments suggest that there are negative impact beyond what we may immediately be able to see of actions or inactions by churches. But I also heard missed opportunities for forgiveness, healing, and reconciliation. Missed opportunities for the church to live into its identity as Christian community. Behind the comments under this category of alienation or alienated are certain expectations that young adults have for how the church should be. Beyond the specifics of any given individual situation, I hope you can hear, as I do, the disappointment and the disconnection that comes from believing and trusting and accepting truths about who the church is supposed to be, who we have, in fact, taught our young people, our youth and our young adults, that the church is supposed to be. Have we miseducated our youth? Are they being too critical? Or are they divine messengers holding us accountable? By now, you probably know that I lean toward the latter question, that they just might be God's messengers to us, holding us accountable to be the church. A second category of comments from young adults who we were interviewed falls under the category of ambivalent, a lack of confidence in the Christian label or uncertainty about what the label means in our current context. And I would even add seeing some levels of contradiction, even within the public square, about what the label Christian means. Now, it is true that millennials have tended to generally reject labels or attempts to limit them or confine them, put them in a box, so to speak. But again, when we push beyond the presenting issue or the presenting concern, what else do we hear? Here are 3 comments we heard. 1, the word Christian comes with a lot of baggage right now in the place and time and culture that we live. I know that I inherit a lot of baggage with that word, and I'm not excited about all the baggage. 2, I'm not 100% Christian. I guess I feel like I can claim it, but maybe others would feel like I wouldn't be able to claim that I was a Christian. Did you hear the ambivalence there? 3, Christian in America does have some negative connotations. I try to be Christ-like in all capacities, And if that is what Christian means, then sure, I could be a Christian. I invite you now to step into a space of reflection. Again, we're not able to provide the space here for you to go deep in your reflection, but I offer some questions for you to think about that might allow you to step more into the shoes of these young adults who we interviewed. One, the first question of reflection. Has there been a time when you felt hurt by or alienated from a Christian faith community? Again, these concerns they are raising are not unique to them, but they're the squeaky wheel right now. If so, if there has been a time when you've been hurt by or felt alienated from a Christian faith community, what happened? How did you handle it? How did the faith community or persons in the faith community where you experienced this respond? How did this experience of alienation impact your alienation and ambivalence? How did it impact your relationship with that particular faith community? And more importantly, how did it impact your relationship with God? Question 2, how would you define being Christian to someone who has no religious affiliation? The image that jumps in my mind is the image of the disciples walking on the Emmaus or the road to Emmaus after Jesus' resurrection. They were talking to a complete stranger, so they thought, trying to explain all the things that had happened. How would you define or explain being Christian to someone who has no religious affiliation? And then the third question for your reflection, beginning now, but certainly continuing after this webinar. What does being a Christian mean to you? And how do you live out being a Christian? I think that when you have time to sit with these questions, or maybe even sit with a group within your congregations and raise these questions, feelings and memories might surface for you that puts you closer in contact with maybe what some young adults in your circle or sphere of influence are experiencing. Now, having offered a little about these two findings from our young adult initiative of being alienated or experiencing past hurt with faith communities and ambivalence about the Christian label, I'd like to offer suggest two biblical and theological implications of these findings. Certainly there are more, but let me focus on two. One, Christian identity, and two, Christian hospitality. Who do you say that I am? No doubt you are familiar with Jesus's transforming question to Peter, who do you say that I am? I posted Luke's version here, but you can also find the passage or the question in Matthew chapter 16, verses 13 through 20, and Mark chapter 8, verses 27 through 30. In this passage, Jesus is pressing his disciple to provide a personal response regarding his identity. His questioning leads Peter to a pivotal confession that informs Peter's post-resurrection ministerial leadership, emphasis on post-resurrection, because we had a little exchange, questionable exchange there between Peter and those who wanted to know who Peter was after Jesus's death. This exchange reminds us, or is instructive to us, in that it models a need for us as Jesus's followers to be clear about who we are following, and thus to be clear about who we are. Ambivalence about our identity, ambivalence about who we are following, can lead to ministry that is inconsistent at a minimum and destructive at its worst. The biblical witness, Hebrew scriptures, and the Christian Testament offer a consistent message about the role that our identity as people of faith should have in informing our behavior. Theologically, we claim that our identity is as those who have been created in God's image. That image, we claim, was incarnated in Jesus. The biblical witness then calls us to live as those who reflect the divine image. Youth ministry scholars like Kenda Creasy-Dean remind us that we, in fact, teach our children and youth who Jesus is. She further claims that when they demonstrate a wishy-washy or ambivalent faith, ambivalent is our word, not hers, we should hold ourselves partly responsible, because we are the ones who taught them who Jesus is. Likewise, when they expect our lives to align with our confession of faith or our profession of faith, they are actually calling us to live according to what we have taught them. The second implication I lift up in this space is of Christian hospitality. And I'm offering up as a text to reflect on 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verses 17 through 22. Now, this passage from Paul's letter to the church at Corinth might appear to be an unlikely reference for this particular context. However, in this passage, this group of Christians are being chastised because they have issues around hospitality and justice. The economically challenged members of the church are being excluded from the table meal or the Lord's Supper because other members, can you get a picture of this? Other members are preventing them from having access to the table. They are literally getting to the table first and over-consuming, I think Paul suggests, the food and drink. Their behavior is inhospitable and unjust. It should not surprise us that this chapter of correctives is then followed by chapter 12 that discusses spiritual gifts, and then chapter 13 where Paul offers the famous treatise on love. Both of those chapters, chapter 12 and 13, reinforce this call to Christian hospitality and justice that we find in chapter 11. When young adults describe the church as hypocritical and alienated, they are really pointing to the absence or a lack of the practices of Christian hospitality and doing justice. You might wonder why I couple those together. Well, without Christian hospitality, generally you will not find acts of justice. And it is interesting that when you look at research that about young adults, doing justice comes very high on their list of priorities. So whether it is a reference to how Christianity is being portrayed in the public square or within individual congregations, I believe it remains a call from our young adults for alignment between claims about our Christian identity and our Christian behavior. Hospitality and justice are part of how our young adults are defining our Christian identity. As you think about everything that has been offered thus far, and maybe even a little of your own reflections and naming that you've been able to do, I want to summarize by calling you to 3 actions. 1, embrace the prophetic witness of young adults. That very first naming that I invited you to do of the 5 young adults who sit on your governing boards connects with this act of embracing the prophetic witness of young adults. Young adults as a category, as a generation, is fairly new. We don't quite know what to do with young adults, and they don't quite know what to do with themselves. They've come out of adolescence, and they're not quite adults, and churches tend to treat them more as adolescents than as the adults that they are and are becoming. So one act for us to consider is embracing that these young adults have been given assignments by God to be a prophetic witness to our congregation, to call us from the church as it is to the church as it shall be. A second act is to revisit the practice of Christian hospitality. If you were to do an audit of your congregation and the ways in which it includes and embraces young adults as they are, what would you come up with? Are you hospitable? Are you inclusive? Not just tolerant, but inclusive and welcoming of young adults. And then the third act, revisit our understanding of Christian identity. Who do you say that Jesus is? And who do you say that you are? And perhaps I should have added earlier, who do you say that young adults are in the eyes of God? For indeed, if all of us have been, who are people of God, have been created in God's image, certainly that includes young adults as well. I'd like to close by returning us to the quote that I started with. The ancestors must be laughing, Dr. Barbara Holmes wrote. How could we have forgotten so easily that prophets arise in every generation? God has gifted us with a generation of young adults who right now are wrestling with feelings of, at least the ones who were a part of our project, wrestling with feelings of being alienated and ambivalent about attaching the label of Christian to themselves. But even in the midst of the wrestling, they still represent or can be a prophetic witness to us today. Those who have ears, let them listen.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It is time now. Dr. Mosby will take questions. And I do see that we have a question here. Somebody has asked if we'll be able to, if the participants will be able to get the slides of the questions shared in this webinar. Yes, I will send those out to you along with the recording within the next couple of days. Any other questions? I have a question.
Okay.
Do young adults, do they have to be churched, or members in order for them to participate in some churches' ministries?
I think that is an excellent question. And in some ways, these categories of churched and unchurched have put us in some of the binds that we are in related to young adults. I think about Jesus's ministry and whether or not there was something comparable for him or comparable categories. And even if there were, he seemed to understand that the mission that he had received from God would not be limited to what might be perceived as the most religious or the people, the insiders, so to speak. In fact, I think his ministry came to transgress the boundaries and be as inclusive as possible. And so that's my way of suggesting to us that maybe these categories of churched and unchurched are not as helpful as we might think that they are, or member and non-member. I sometimes wonder what would happen if we were not so focused on defining our outreach as being for members or insiders. What if we were willing to extend ourselves to young adults within our proximity, not necessarily within our church, but within our proximity, and count that as ministry? In the same way, even if they never came to our churches to be members, count that as ministry in the same way as we count the young people and the young adults who are a part of our congregations or who are members of our church. What would happen if both were valid forms of ministry in our perspective? And I don't say this as a kind of a critic sitting on a hill, but as one who has participated served in pastoral ministry for over 3 decades. So it's not an abstract question for me. It's a real question that I often sought to push the congregations that I've served on. What would it look like if we got rid of the categories of churched and unchurched and saw all people as opportunities within our proximity, certainly, as opportunities to be in partnership with God as God is working in the world.
Thank you. Good information to think about. We have not a question from the group, but a statement. The statement reads, I am AME and a pastor. We do allow youth from the community to participate in some ministries of dance and music. They attend Bible studies with us, although they belong to other congregations, and it is their mission, ministry outreach.
Yeah, I think that is very exciting. And perhaps the most exciting part of that comment for me rather is the power and potential that lies in collaboration between religious communities. I am in a community where there are a number of churches and none of them have sufficient resources at all times. And yet, if they were to collaborate, for instance, with summer programming, it could be that the children in the community, as well as the children in the churches, could have an entire month in the summer covered without any one congregation having to bear the entire financial or human resource weight of that ministry. And same with young adults, that if we saw all of the young adults as part of our ministries, then what if churches were to collaborate in the same way that this person is talking about? We're willing to collaborate. If you don't have any young adults, what would happen if your congregation supported a congregation that does? I just think that that particular comment points to the tremendous potential that lies in churches being even more collaborative, perhaps, than they already are.
Thank you. Any other questions from our participants? There's a Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. If you type your questions in there, I can read them to Dr. Mosby. We can answer them. So I've been doing some reading. I'll ask a question while other people are sort of getting their thoughts together. I've been doing some reading, and Anne Wimberly is a religious educator and a scholar, and she emphasizes a necessity for congregations to develop intergenerational ministry opportunities. In a different arena, like corporations, they have adopted a model of what they call reverse mentoring that allow young employees with particular expertise to train older employees in those areas and vice versa. What are some possibilities that you've seen in your experience for intergenerational encounters and or reverse mentoring within some of the congregations you've worked with?
I will say, I'll answer the question in a different way. One of my laments or concerns related to some of the young adult initiatives that are arising today, for instance, like Black Lives Matter, and for Chicago, 100 Black Youth Project, is the absence, for instance, the absence of the wisdom of the community and the wisdom of elders, as well as a lament for the congregations who may not have a vibrant young adult ministry, the absence of their perspective and their expertise in the life of the church. And what intergenerational ministries, as Dr. Wimberly suggests, do is make space and make room for the community to walk together, to in some ways exercise the African principle of Sankofa, where you're in the present, but you're reaching back and you're getting what is needed for living in the present, but also for looking forward and for visioning. One of the churches that I served had a rites of passage ministry that allowed for this kind of intergenerationality with elders mentoring and walking alongside young adults, but also creating spaces where these young adults who were going through the program were able to exercise their voices and offer their wisdom as well. And so that was a program that has been very successful. And I think one of the reasons for its success is related to it being a space where generations could come together, not one knowing more than the other, but each generation knowing differently than the other, but working together toward a common goal.
That's a lot of information to take in and process. I'm sure that's what some of our participants are doing now. They're processing this information and they may have questions later.
Absolutely.
So I encourage you, if you, for those of you on the webinar, if you do have questions, once you have kind of sat with this information and given it some thought that you want to ask Dr. Mosby, please feel free to email us. Our email is connectional.learning at Garrett.edu. It's connectional.learning@Garrett.edu. And I'm going to find the slide that has Dr. Mosby's contact information, because you can also email her directly. And we hope that you will mark your calendars for next week's webinar, same time, same station, and join us for the final session of this webinar series. I don't see any more questions and answers, so they may come down in the future. But again, there on the screen is Dr. Mosby's email address, so you can email her directly or you can email us. And please make sure you join us next week. And thank you, Dr. Karen Mosby, for your presentation. And thank you to our audience for your participation. We hope you have a good week.